this is the overview for tonight's session. We're going to begin with a discussion about modification of housing. We're going to talk about some terms, and I hope that I wanted to start really basic because I know we're all coming from different places. Yeah. Then we'll talk about housing in Seville, and then talk about some ways that we might have a better future ahead of us. So we're going to begin by talking about housing as a commodity. The commodification of housing pits the needs of people who need a home to live in against the needs of people who want to profit from that home. And when we're talking about commodification as socialists, we have a really specific meaning of that. In Marxist thought, a commodity is something produced by labor that can be bought and sold in the market. Commodification is the process by which something that was not a commodity becomes one. So, mostly you have to pay for a place to live, either by renting it or buying it. Some people get to inherit it, but they're probably not at this event. So you're stuck writing a check each month so you can live comfortably and have some privacy. That hasn't always been the case. It isn't the case everywhere right now, and it doesn't have to be the case for us right here in the future. So we're going to start by talking about use value. To understand how socialists think about housing, it's useful to understand the distinction between use value and exchange value, concepts that Marx introduces right at the very beginning of Capital. The use value is the utility something has in and of itself, without regard to its relative value compared to other things. If something exists and serves a use, or can satisfy a need, that utility constitutes its use value. We also have exchange value. By contrast, exchange value, which is the relative value of a commodity to other commodities, isn't inherent to the thing itself. Instead, it emerges as the result of something becoming something that can be bought and sold in the market. An object can be incredibly useful if it can't be sold on the market, like air or human organs in theory. It has no exchange value, no matter how useful it is. Other things can have exchange values much higher than their actual utility. So what does this mean for housing? Understanding the difference between use value and exchange value helps us understand what goes on in the housing market. A tenant is concerned with a housing unit's use value. They need a comfortable place to eat, sleep, relax, do all the other things that you do in your house. The landlord, on the other hand, is concerned about a housing unit's exchange value. They want to receive the highest rent possible, and they want the sale value of the house to increase. If your rent goes up 20%, it's not because you'll be getting 20% more satisfaction out of your apartment. It's because your landlord can command more in exchange for the apartment than they could before. On the flip side, in some places, like in certain neighborhoods of Manhattan, where people from outside the city buy units as an investment, 50% of apartments are empty. So their exchange value is phenomenal, but since they don't serve any function, their use value is negligible. So this leads to an affordability crisis. So we'll talk in concrete terms about how this manifests today. There's a housing affordability crisis in the United States. The percentage of households who own their home has declined by more than 6% since the 2008 economic crisis. As the number of renters has increased, the number of rental units has barely budged. And as a result, over the past 7 years, rents in the United States have risen 28%. In 2001, about 40% of renters spent more than 30% of their income on rent, which is the threshold above which you're considered rent burdened. Now nearly half do. In expensive rental markets, the number of people without a house or housing continues to grow. In Los Angeles in 2019, for example, the population of people without homes grew by 26% over the preceding year. And as in the rest of American life, power and wealth continuously flowed from the working class to the owning class. This is, if you talk to a capitalist, this is the kind of thing that capitalism is supposed to be great at. There's high demand, there's low supply, the market should correct itself, but it doesn't. New construction starts in the US are level with the 1980s, when the population of the United States was 25% smaller. And those housing units that are being built are increasingly being built for the high end of the market. In 2001, about 15% of new units cost more than $1,500 a month in current dollars. By 2016, that number had increased to 40%. So now we're going to look at what Engels had to say. And this is from The Housing Question, which Friedrich Engels published in 1872 as a response to both anarchist and liberal views on the issue of housing. In particular, it's a polemic against the anarchist theories of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and his followers, as well as liberal thinkers of the day. So Proudhon's view was that the wage worker, as the wage worker is in relation to the capitalist, so is the tenant in relation to the house owner. The solution was for tenants to take possession of their own homes by paying a fair rent to the previous owner until they had paid the entire value of the house. Engels' response, and it's an impressive beard. Engels responds that the Proudhonists misunderstand the relationship between tenant and landlord. Unlike the capitalists, the landlord doesn't exploit the tenant's labor power to create new value. Instead, Engels says it's a simple commodity change. There are two people, the tenant and the landlord. The former wishes to purchase from the latter the temporary use of a dwelling. So it's a simple commodity sale. It's not an operation between proletarian and bourgeois. So the root of the problem must lie elsewhere. At the same time, the Proudhonist solution that tenants should become owners also isn't a socialist solution. Even at the fair price, it would still burden the working class with debt. Moreover, it would tie workers to one spot, making it harder to apply pressure by striking or leaving. For Engels, what this really comes down to is that the commodification of housing itself lies at the heart of the housing problem. So the solution is not to change who owns the commodity, but to reorient it by removing it from the realm of commodities. So the bourgeois solution is, what we saw at in the Engels quote earlier, that the result is the same. The scandalous alleys and lanes disappear, but they appear again immediately somewhere else, and often in the immediate neighborhood. So housing problems of housing supply are solved by just moving them somewhere else. And we see this really clearly in something that was going on at the time in Haussmann's Paris. The most famous example is Paris, where under the leadership of Napoleon III, Georges Eugène Haussmann undertook an enormous renovation of the city from 1853 to 1870, with some projects that were still worked on as late as the 1920s. Haussmann introduced the city's wide avenues, built dozens of parks and squares, rationalized the city's layout, and installed a sewer and other water systems. This progress came at the expense of the city's working class, though. Rents in Paris increased by more than 300%, while wages remained flat. Working class Parisians were forced from the center of the city to the newly annexed 17th and 20th arrondissement. Sorry, I studied French in college. On the city's periphery. I'm going to try and not do French pronunciations, though. I know how it sounds. Not coincidentally, Houseman's reforms also made it more difficult for the working class to rise up. Paris's working class had undertaken 6 armed uprisings between 1830 and 1848. The city's narrow medieval streets made throwing up a barricade a simple task, relatively speaking, and the irregular layout hindered the advance of soldiers who were mostly people coming from outside the city. So it was easy for them to get, confused and lost, and it gave the Parisians a real advantage. But with the wide avenues and the more rational street plan, there was only one more Paris uprising after Haussmann's projects in 1871. In his memoir, Haussmann himself took credit for, quote, for the gutting of old Paris, the quarter of riots and barricades. So what does this have to do with Charlottesville? In Charlottesville, the same process Engels described has played out for decades as capitals flowed into the city, especially through the university and the medical center. The city has improved for the affluent at the expense of the working class. The picture on this slide is Vinegar Hill, which a lot of you probably know is a working class Black neighborhood close to Charlottesville's downtown that was leveled in the name of urban renewal. It's where the Staples is now, was sort of the heart of the neighborhood. Working class neighborhoods like Belmont and Woolen Mills have become steadily more expensive, but in the city's working class Black neighborhoods, the process has been much worse. Some neighborhoods like Vinegar Hill have been torn down entirely, while in other areas like 10th and Page and Fifeville, the end of legal segregation without any kind of restitution has opened the neighborhoods to affluent white residents while keeping previously legally white neighborhoods like Venable and Greenbrier out of reach. And so the effect of this is that low-income residents are being displaced from Charlottesville. The Charlottesville lost 1,500 low-income residents citywide between 2010 and 2018. And, when you consider that, the population of the town is only like 35,000, it's not a small number. But what are we going to do about it? As socialists, we don't think it's enough to understand what's wrong with the system. We aim to change it. Organizing to build socialism is central to being a socialist. So we're going to talk about what Seville DSA is doing to address the area's housing crisis, and more importantly, what we'd like to do as we grow. Then we'll look at a few other models for housing that have been tried around the world and have a discussion about what a future with decommodified housing might look like. So Seville DSA's Housing Justice Committee is formulating what we think is a socialist response to the housing problem. We're operating on 2 timelines. In the short term, we recognize the most vulnerable members of the community are facing a true catastrophe, and our immediate work is to alleviate that. In the long run, though, we want to build the infrastructure and the power to make real substantive changes to housing in the city and the county. So our short-term work is centered around eviction prevention. Virginia offers very few legal protections to tenants. So the COVID eviction crisis hit tenants here especially hard. That's meant that Seville DSA's Housing Justice Committee has had to focus on the short-term goal of keeping tenants housed and improving affordability. One of the main goals of our work has been educating households that are facing eviction about their rights and the resources that are available to them, and also helping take advantage of those. There have been 3 prongs to this work. First, we canvass every household on the eviction docket in Charlottesville and Albemarle and talk with as many people face to face as we can. It's the best way to get information into their hands and to encourage them to come to court. Then we table outside the courthouse with information that's focused specifically on what they'll need once they go in. And finally, we observe court hearings and record data about them. Our initial purpose in that was, to let the legal system know they were being watched and hope that that might make them at least try to create the appearance of fairness. But it turned out actually that the data collection bit was really important because we had eviction data that nobody else in the city had. And so when the Human Rights Commission was talking about right to counsel for eviction cases, there was a strong sense from a lot of the councilors, city councilors, that it wasn't necessary because there wasn't really a bad problem, but they didn't have the numbers. And so we were able to put together a report that showed that it is a serious problem, and also to show the racial inequalities in evictions in Charlottesville. And we have won, in theory, right to counsel, although the money has not been allocated yet. So we're not patting ourselves on the back yet. In the long term, though, we'd like to switch to doing some more socialist work. We're really excited. One of the reasons we're really excited about the possibility of right to counsel is that it will free us up from the eviction work that takes up most of the committee's time. Because the anti-eviction work is a really good thing to do, and I'm really proud of it, but it's not socialist work in the sense that it's not building socialism. It's not, it's helping folks survive capitalism, which is not nothing, but it doesn't challenge the capitalist housing framework. So our long-term goal is to take on real socialist organizing around housing. One major project the committee has identified as a priority is tenant organizing, with the aim of eventually building tenant unions that can place the same kind of pressure on landlords that labor unions place on capitalists. Charlottesville is a challenging environment because the types of rental units that we have are not the most amenable to organizing. Outside the student areas, they tend to be large complexes with lots of buildings with only a few households in each. So they're not the kind of place that are conducive to building a sense of solidarity that you might find in a large apartment building where everyone shares the same problems with that building. So organizing in Charlottesville is going to require us to take a really thoughtful approach and commit to building slowly over a long time. And that means that, our biggest constraint is just how many people we have volunteering. So the more people we have, the more of this kind of work that we can take on. Now, another idea, which is still being formed, is working to permanently house all unhoused people. Some other countries have virtually eliminated this problem by simply ensuring people have a place to be. This work will probably involve a lot of legislative groundwork at both the state and local level to be successful. So it's another place where having a really robust committee will make a difference. So I encourage all of you to join the Housing Justice Committee. So now we're going to look at we're going to break into discussion rooms in a second, but we're going to look at some examples of a couple of leftist answers to the housing question to kind of start thinking about how we might restructure housing in the future to center it around human need. So first, we're going to talk about Red Vienna, which is sort of the poster child of successful social housing. Vienna, as the capital of Austria, has been governed by Austria's Social Democratic Workers' Party since 1919, except for the period from 1934 to 1945, when the country was under control of the Nazis. When the SDAP came to power in the immediate aftermath of the First War, the city was in severe crisis. The war had crippled the national economy, created an influx of refugees, sparked a period of hyperinflation, and fostered twin pandemics, the Spanish flu and tuberculosis. The city's burgeoning population, unsanitary conditions made housing a primary focus of the new government. And unlike the other renovations of cities that we've observed elsewhere. In Vienna, the city was built anew, not at the expense of the working class, but for the benefit of the working class. By 1934, 10% of the city lived in an apartment owned by the city. And following the Nazis' defeat, Vienna socialists picked up where they left off, building even more municipal housing. Even today, 3 in 5 residents live in housing owned, built, or managed by the municipal government. Because social housing in Vienna and Austria more generally was never treated as an option of last resort, but as a means to provide clean, comfortable homes to everyone, about 80% of the population is eligible for a housing subsidy. The cutoff is about twice the national average income. And that ensures that social housing is popular and the political will exists to keep to perpetuate it and to keep it well maintained, in contrast to public housing in the United States. And then another one we're going to look at is Sweden's 1 million homes program. In the 1960s, Sweden's urban centers boomed while rural areas saw steep declines in population, which created the sort of paradoxical housing shortage we face in the contemporary US, which is why I chose this one. There are a lot of vacant homes in the US. They're just in the wrong places. They're not in the burgeoning urban centers. So unlike the US, which has taken a hands-off approach to addressing this mismatch, the Swedish government under the Social Democratic Party undertook a program to build 1 million homes. And just to give you an idea of how ambitious that is, the housing stock when they started was only 3 million homes. So it was a really big program, and by the 70s it was so successful that they began to have problems with vacancies, and the low rents for the municipal housing also drove down rents in the private market. So now that we have discussed done the presentation portion, we're going to do breakout groups. I wanted to keep this like pretty open, so these questions are pretty broad, so we can have an open conversation. Sorry. You can ignore 3 and 4. That was from the template that I used. So the first question is, what have your experiences with housing in Charlottesville been like? And what would you like housing to look like in a socialist future? And that concludes the presentation. Okay, so perfect. We're halfway through. So we'll break out for, I think, 15 to 20 minutes and rejoin.